I call this meeting to order. I have my mic now. Please call the roll.
One moment, please. Okay, Councilmember Bouders?
Here.
Councilmember Donahue?
Here.
Councilmember Martinez?
Here.
Vice Mayor Pats?
Here.
And Mayor Medina.
Here. Can we get approval of the final agenda? I know it's a complicated one.
So moved.
Second.
All right, we've got a motion by Member Martinez, a second by Member Bouders. Please call the roll.
Councilmember Bouders?
Aye.
Councilmember Donahue?
Aye.
Councilmember Martinez?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Pats?
Aye.
And Mayor Medina.
Aye. Any ex parte communications to report?
No.
None. We're
I have had a meeting with SEIU 10-1 local. I have had a meeting with the Emeryville Police Officers Association and the Alameda County Fire Department, or Alameda County Fire Local 55.
I spoke with POA.
Okay. All right. Any public comment for items not on the agenda? Nope. All right. Item 6.1, City Council consideration of placing a measure requesting voter approval of special sales and use tax on the March 3rd, 2020 ballot.
Madam Mayor, we have 3 topics that we would like you to discuss tonight. We'll start with a presentation. Let me just back up. As you'll recall, on October 1st, we were here reporting to you on the possibility of developing a ballot measure for March of 2020, and particularly a sales tax measure. And we asked your permission to proceed with a community survey, which we did. We retained TBWB and EMC Research to conduct the poll, which they have done, and they are here tonight to present the results of that poll, which is also in your packet. So we'll ask the representatives of those firms to go through that presentation. After that, we'd like you to discuss the results, ask any questions, of course, that you have about the results of the poll, and also then provide direction or comment and direction to us on the content of what the legislation would be that would place that measure on the ballot. So I'm asking you to think about that as you go through hearing the poll results. What are the specific services, if you would like specific services to be in the measure, what are the specific services that you would like to include to be funded? And give us some direction on that so we can finalize the legislation and bring it forward to you no later than December 3rd. And then finally, you'll be hearing from TBWB's representative regarding communication to the public that we would like to undertake starting next month in November. We think that it's important to get some information out there for people to be aware of this. So we would like to get your feedback on what kind of communication we would be putting out there to the public in November. So I'll go over this all again after the presentation, but I just wanted to set that framework so you could be thinking about that as we go through the poll results. And with that, I would ask our consultant representatives to introduce themselves to you and walk through the survey results.
Can you hear me? Do I have to lean in? Okay. Good evening, Madam Mayor and members of the City Council. My name is Emily Goodman. I'm a Senior Vice President at EMC Research, and we recently conducted a survey about a potential ballot measure for next year, and so I'm going to show you the results of that. Quick note on methodology. We have 302 total interviews. The margin of error is about plus or minus 5.5, just over that. The survey was conducted in a variety of ways, including email to web, text to web, and phones, and the phones included landlines and cell phones. And the survey respondents are reflective of the likely voting demographic for next year. A few overall key findings before we look at the specific numbers. We see that in general, Emeryville voters are feeling very happy about the way that things are going and have positive opinions about the quality of life and the city services and the city council. We see that a potential sales tax measure to fund public safety and early childhood education, specifically the center, is potentially viable for next year. And we see that voters care about the things that the money would help pay for, specifically public safety and the child care center for preschool and families. So we see when we tested additional information to see kind of where support for the potential measure might go. Additional information helps to bolster support, and then when we read some potential negative messaging that might be out there, we see support dip just below or kind of right at the 2/3 threshold needed for passage. So looking at right direction, wrong track, which is just sort of a mood question, it helps put the overall results into context. We see that in general, Emeryville voters are feeling positively about the direction of the city. A majority think that the city is headed in the right direction, 53% compared to 22% who say that the city's in the wrong, headed in the wrong track or off on the wrong track. And 26% didn't really have an opinion or were neutral about the direction of the city. The mayor and city council, plurality feels positively about the mayor and city council, so 47% positive, 19% negative, and 34% can't rate or haven't heard or didn't have an opinion. Likewise, for the local business community, also very popular, 71% of voters have a favorable opinion of the local business community compared to 10% who have an unfavorable rating. And then when we asked about additional funding to maintain essential services, we see that a majority of voters say that they perceive a need for additional funding, 53% compared to 21% who say that there's no need for additional funding. Looking at a few ratings of the city services specifically, so the quality of fire services rates very highly, 68% total positive. We see quality of police services, similar top ratings there, 72% positive. The quality of life, 76%. Quality of city services generally, 68% positive. The management of the city budget, 34% positive, but there's quite a big unknown, so folks are just not really aware, couldn't answer the ratings of the city on the management front. Looking at an initial vote or initial ask of a potential ballot measure, you see what's in the gray box is the exact language that we asked about. So it was a 1/4 cent sales tax that would generate approximately $2.2 million to fund, faster 911 response times, protecting the safety of Emeryville residents, and helping local families with the Childhood Development Center. We see support is at 73% total yes. That includes 70% who were solidly in support, and then a handful who leaned with some rounding. That's where we get to 73, 26% oppose, and as a friendly reminder, the threshold to pass this type of special sales tax is 2/3. Looking at a few of the priorities, so these are things that the new money would potentially help pay for. We see the safety of protecting the safety of Emeryville residents overwhelmingly important to voters, 87% total important. That includes 58% who rated that on a scale of 1 to 7. They gave it a 7 for extremely important. Reducing property crimes and auto burglaries, 52% of voters found that to be extremely important. Maintaining police and emergency services, 50% extremely important. And then looking at some of the childhood elements, so childcare and preschool for local families, you see sort of everything is important to voters by well over 2/3. Looking at a few additional items, we see, almost everything that we tested was important to voters, at least 2/3 are right on the margin there. So potential things that the sales tax or the new sales tax could help fund are all important to voters. And looking at some additional information, things that people might say in support of a measure like this, we see the childhood brain development occurring before the age 5 is a pretty compelling reason to support the measure. 70% find that to be convincing. Again, early childhood education measures, and then the ability to hire additional public safety officers and other people like that to help fight crime across the city. All of this is pretty compelling information, and we see support for a potential measure increases a little bit on the solid, so we see kind of holds on and increases support just a little bit when we're able to share additional information about, what the measure might do, what it might pay for. So 74% of voters support the measure after additional information. And then on the flip side, we read some potential opposition arguments against the measure to measure, potential vulnerability. And we see that, the collective result of that is, it does erode support a little bit, but just kind of hovers right at the 2/3 threshold. So in conclusion, we see that voters perceive a need for additional funding, and over 2/3 are initially in favor of the proposed sales tax. And should you all decide to put something on the ballot, we recommend a privately funded campaign effort to be able to share some of that additional information about things that are important to voters and what the measure might pay for. So we have a representative from TBWB, to Sean. I'll let him talk through. This is just the timeline of, kind of where we are today compared to where you would need to go should you decide to place something on the ballot.
Good afternoon. Once again, my name is Tashawn Thomas with TBWB Strategies. As was mentioned earlier, we are now at the point of educating the council about the polling and steps to move forward in order to educate the community, in order to ensure that when it's on the ballot, people understand what's going on. In terms of council action, you have 2 future dates in which you can place the measure on the ballot. Those are November 19th and December 3rd, knowing that the deadline for calling the election is on December the 6th. And that's just not voting to call it. All forms and paperwork must be into the county by 5 o'clock on December the 6th. So it's very important to meet those deadlines as well. But before that, it is recommended that there is an education piece that is involved with the community. So what TBWB would do is create those fact sheets, talking points. We've recommended 2 mailers, one that educates the community specifically about the sales tax measure and exactly what it will do, the priorities based off of council's decision, and then a second mailer after the decision has been made to place it on the ballot to educate the community to look out for this measure as it moves forward. We would also create talking points, FAQs, things of that nature, introductory messaging for the city to use. All informational pieces, not advocacy related, so that it stays within legal guidelines as well. And so everything is vetted not only by TBWB, but it will also be vetted by your city attorney's office as well.
There might be some. Oh, that's it.
That's it.
Any clarifying questions?
Yes, sir.
Were all the polls done of registered Emeryville voters?
Yes.
Okay.
Anything else? Yeah.
On the statistics we had where people polled positively about the things they thought should be funded, so we had the page where maybe you can pull that slide back up. Yes. So did we do any, it doesn't appear we did any questioning of the crossover of these. So I'm just wondering because, I don't know if it was this page, maybe it was this page. There was a page, yeah, maybe it's this page. So for example, is there a page that asks specifically, would you vote for this, like funding, adding police services? Didn't we have a page that had like a broader paragraph of?
Was it
after this one?
It was asking about
that
what?
one right
Sorry?
there.
Oh, okay, right. Additional information.
Yeah. So after they get the additional information, so you see they're all different amounts at the end on the convincing, and the prior slides about the need. Do we think these services are good or the need? I was just wondering if we can disaggregate by survey participant their responses to see crossover, because I'm wondering, for example, what is the actual what is the actual interest in some of the crossing messages? So there may be people, for example, who say, I support funding for early childhood education, but I don't for police.
Right.
And there may be some people who say that the converse, right? Like, I support funding for police, but child education is not my thing. And so I'd be curious to know if we did any questioning about if there was, for both of those kinds of individuals, if the funding for the thing you wanted was there and there were other things to be funded, would you still vote for this, right? Does one of those outweigh, would the negative keep the person who says, I do support voting for police services, but I'm not going to vote for something that's going to pay for childcare? So like, we lose that vote, or do we actually increase the number of people we have in the total overall, because we've got people who cover both but for separate reasons?
Yeah, I mean, we can, parse that out and look at it specifically, but given how high support is for the measure, I suspect that there's mostly crossover and that people are supporting both public safety elements and childcare elements.
Okay. So it's not like it's two different groups of people and we actually might have a larger number of supporters.
I think there's mostly crossover. There might be a little bit of, people who prioritize childcare or public safety more intensely, but not to the degree that they would vote no, because we see that the no voters are just so small. Yeah.
Yeah. And we didn't ask or do any questioning about the county's childcare measure, did we?
No.
Okay. I have one question for staff, if I could ask.
I will say, sorry,
There
one
was
other
a county
thing.
question, right?
Was there a county question?
There wasn't a county question, but I'm just looking back through these.
Tested
I
a
think
negative.
We characterized it as, lots of measures being on the ballot, something like that, but not explicitly
That
county
specific
childcare.
proposal?
Yeah.
Okay, I have
Although
one.
it's difficult to know exactly what.
Okay, I have one special question for staff, which is, do we know how much of the sales tax that we, as a percentage of the total revenues we take in annually, is roughly, or an estimation? Do we have an estimation of how much is paid by locals versus people who are not from the city of Emeryville?
We don't have that data.
Okay, that's my questions.
Member Martinez.
I have a question for staff. If we specify the expenditures in the ballot measure and thereby create a special tax and need to meet that 66.6 threshold, what happens if a future council defunds one of those positions in the budgetary process, or if calamitously something happened and when a department went away?
Councilmember, my answer to that would be it's dependent upon how the ordinance is structured, about whether individual positions need to be funded for the life of the tax or whether services need to be funded.
Services.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, if there's no other clarifying questions, we're going to open it up for public comment. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Just punt this to the.
All right, we'll take public comment. Yep.
I'm also going to need someone to yield time for the full comment tonight.
Get someone.
Do we do that ahead of time?
Yeah, you have to have someone come up and say, I yield my time. Let's do this.
Diana Kina, and I'm a member of the union, and I yield time to Navarre.
Great. You got 6 minutes.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor. Good evening, Council. My name is Navarre Oaks, and I am the Chief Steward for SCI Local 1021 at the City of Emeryville. We support this measure and have some ideas how to make it even better. So first, the staff report states that, quote, additional firefighter positions, plural, and additional police officer positions, plural, shall be funded. The number of positions needs to be stated explicitly. This tax will only generate an estimated $2 million per year. If these funds are to accomplish all of the stated goals, the number of police and fire positions will need to be capped. Secondly, when we talk about public safety and reducing response times, often the first image that comes to mind is that of first responders. But we all know that is only part of the story. As an alternative to funding multiple police officer positions, we propose that some of this funding could be more efficiently used by hiring a GIS mapping and website expert. The city already pays for GIS and website resources, but we don't have the staffing available to maximize, let alone maintain, these crucial resources. A GIS mapping and website position will benefit police and fire directly, while also supporting other departments, including public works, planning, and building, all of which depend on the same interwoven data. I lost my place. For emergency response, community notification, and safe infrastructure. Furthermore, a GIS and website expert would be a valuable addition to our Emergency Operations Center, our EOC, which is necessary in times of crisis, such as when the cities need to respond to high winds, fire, power outages, and earthquakes. Additionally, non-officer positions and police are needed. First, one additional police evidence technician, and secondly, one additional record specialist. Currently, these positions are inundated. As the city grows, we need more capacity to fill these crucial roles. Third, polling showed that maintaining the Emeryville Child Development Center, providing safe and nurturing care for children and families, attracting and retaining quality child care workers and preschool teachers, improving early childhood education, and providing affordable child care and preschool for local families all polled higher than providing faster 911 emergency response, hiring and equipping police officers, increasing neighborhood police patrols, and improving local fire protection services. Despite this, the last funded item listed is funding to support the Emeryville Child Development Center and/or capital improvement projects. So 2 things. 1, based on existing funding needs, the stated intent of this tax, and the stated priorities of those polled, the Emeryville Child Development Center needs to be listed and actually prioritized first. Secondly, and/or CIP needs to be removed. Nowhere else in the polling, in the staff report, in the ordinance, or resolution is a CIP mentioned. Council just approved a 5-year, $91 million capital improvement program, but the way this is worded, the Emeryville Child Development Center funding can be compromised by using this tax for the CIP. Funding the CIP is not consistent with the stated intent of this tax. This ballot measure is a creative solution to staffing needs and a great opportunity. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I do not think you even hit 6 minutes. Not even close. Next up.
Good evening, Council. My name is Andrea Malarkey, and I am an SEIU 10-to-1 member leader and the co-chair of the Alameda County COPE Committee. And I just wanted to underscore some of the points that Navarre has made. Obviously, SEIU 10-to-1 is very excited that you are pursuing a revenue measure. Lots of our members will benefit, as well as the community at large, which is always our goal. We are very interested in being partners in the discussion process related to how the funds generated might be used. As you can tell, our members have put a lot of energy into looking at the opportunities here, and we look forward to being part of the conversation. And just a heads up that in the next few days, you should be expecting phone calls for individual meetings to talk these things through, so that we can really make sure that the money lands where it's going to be best used to serve Emeryvillians. Thank you very much.
Good evening, Star Trekkers. My name is Bill Reuter. I chair the Budget Advisory Committee for the city. This measure, I think, is a necessary step, although I regret to say that the step we're taking does involve a regressive tax. That's not my favorite way of going, but the necessity's there. We all know the 5-year projections, revenue flattening, expenses increasing. We've got to do something about that, and the sooner we do it, the better. Regarding priorities and so forth, I leave that to the folks who are right in the belly of the beast and are working on it hard, and I'm sure you'll listen carefully to what they have to say. So those are my only comments. Thanks.
Any other public comment? All right. Seeing none, I'm going to open it up for discussion. I'd like to start off with the members of our ad hoc committee. I know you've put in a lot of work and time and thought into this. Does one of you want to go first? Member Martinez?
Sure, I will echo what our citizen Bill Reuter has mentioned, which is the prognosis for the city's budget. While we've been very responsible, there are issues that are out of our control, as Bill mentioned, a flattening sales tax, and expenses that are going up. So I think this is a really good opportunity, and I think what the polling shows is there's a lot of support for continuing to support the really good services that we already provide in this city. I I don't know if the people being polled know that the city struggles every year to make sure that we have enough money to support the Child Development Center, that's a source of pride for the community, but it comes at a pretty steep cost relative to the amount of people that it serves. But we're very fortunate for the work that happens there and for the kids of Emeryville. So I'm personally in support of putting this measure on the ballot in March, and I look forward to talking about the specifics with all of you.
Thank you. Member Bowders.
My initial comments, Madam Mayor, are simply to agree with Councilmember Martinez at this point. I think everything she said is, I would just add on my name to those comments at this time.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Pats.
Thank you. I want to address some of the comments because I had similar thoughts. Is that echoing badly?
Mildly.
Mildly. Sorry. I'm sorry. Oh, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to switch mics because that was bothering me. Sorry. We're not Star Trekkers. We're Starfleet officers. It's an important distinction in my culture. So I'm going to throw that out there. I think of all the amazing things that the city does, ECDC to me is one of the most amazing. Early childhood is invaluable. Funding it is incredibly important, and I agree that it should be our top priority in all of this. I was glad to see the voters or the residents support that in the polling. I shared some similar thoughts with SEIU. I looked at it a little bit differently, but when I looked at what, we have a finite amount of resources. We have a lot of areas that we need to address. And for me, I looked at this ordinance, and I like that it was not explicit numbers. It didn't define what we had because we didn't get locked in. And I think that's going to be a bigger conversation. I'm just going to look to the city attorney to see how explicit we have to be versus how much flexibility, because I think things change. My preference over 2 officers, which was the number that was thrown out 6 or 7 months ago when we talked about this initially, was that I think we do need another officer. I look at the overtime reports and I look at staffing at the police department, and I think adding an officer there would be invaluable. But for the cost of that second officer, I think there are other services that we need to increase. I was looking at the crime analyst. I really like the framing of it. I'm going to say GIS mapping is what I wrote down in my notes. But this idea of taking a look at the data that we collect and the information and being able to be strategic and thoughtful across the board with our public safety is really important to me. And we had to eliminate that position, I'm going to go about 18 months ago. And, the idea that we could use some of that money to bring back and really provide some extra tools to the police department was really the direction I'd like to see us go. And then the other piece, I think about all the many hats that police officers have to wear when they're out in the field and what consumes time. And when we look at time that the officers spend in the field, it is usually around the frequent flyers, the people that are struggling with mental health, with substances. And so I was again thinking, for the cost of a single officer, we can bring in a social worker at a lower cost and relieve officers of the time they spend with a citizen contact in crisis, and hand it off to someone who can do the follow-up and really have a different approach to it. There's the story I always use. There was a great article out of Portland about a police officer who had arrested the same man, I'm going to say for vagrancy, for another crime. And he decided that his first goal was to get this man an ID, and it took him 6 months working with somebody he knew and could positively identify to get him a government-issued ID before that person could even get to services. And the officer did it on his own time. But to ask our public safety officers to do that on the clock is a challenge. But that is definitely the role a social worker can fill. And I'm using these job titles very loosely, but the idea of somebody who could be that point person for our frequent flyers is, to me, the better allocation of our limited resources, because it does free up officers, which is one of our goals, to do more policing. And then I like the idea of having a crime analyst or a data person to help them be more strategic in how they roll out the forces that they do have and be on that end. And I like the idea that there could be some crossover with fire and other needs. So those are my thoughts on this.
Thank you.
Yep.
Member Donahue.
I support this measure, and I really appreciate some of the thoughtful comments that Novar had, that looking at safety going forward, the GIS web mapping, I think would be significant, because if I just think about the history of pedestrian and bicycle accidents in our city, if we had very effective mapping, I think we would see public infrastructure issues that we would address that we're missing. And I think that is just something that we really should address, and it would be good if this could help pay for that. I appreciate also that that the early childhood education polled slightly higher, that people recognize that the future through our children is important, and that this is something that really does matter. So I think we have to really think about leading with that as an approach.
Thank you. I'd like to thank my colleagues on the ad hoc committee for really spending a lot of time, and frankly our staff for spending a lot of time giving us the ability to do this through the legislative process. I think it's an important step for our city in terms of keeping ourselves fiscally responsible. If anyone else saw the auditor's report, we do look like a little green dot oasis in the East Bay area. Thank you. However, I think it feeds into this perception that most people have that Emeryville is a very wealthy city, and we're not. We often see that our 5-year projections are going down and that we have trouble funding into the second and third year of our budget. So diversifying our revenue like this is extremely important. I wanted to bring up our council priorities just as a frame of reference. I had them placed up here for everyone. I think it's important that we remind ourselves of how this can fit into our priorities as a group. And I'd like to note that over half of these are directly public works related priorities. And so I think the code enforcement officer position mentioned in here, being able to pull away some of that workload from other public works or related staff, I know that that goes out of public works and everyone gets hit with those sort of concerns. Is an extremely important one that I wanted to elevate in the framework of our council priorities. Again, I think early childhood education was really grasped on by our voters and has time and time again come up as something they strongly support, as well as public safety, which is always a win with voters, let's face it. So I want to, Christine, get down to what level of direction do you need to have here tonight? Do we need to give you hard numbers, prioritization, or like exact wording for the ballot question? How can we best move this process along, since we are in a very tight time frame? Yeah.
See you all. So we are almost at the 11th hour on this in terms of getting some clarity about what is going to be in this measure. It is a choice. You can have a general tax. You do not have to specify the services that would be funded by this measure. We didn't test that in the poll. We tested a special tax defining the services. What is in the draft ordinance that's before you, I just want to clarify, Vice Mayor, that was not intended to be a proposal. All I was doing was carrying forward what you all had started discussing last spring in May, and then as I had reiterated in the report on October 1st, which was at the end of a long meeting, so we weren't able to really get any further direction that night. So that list is in, so let me just in terms of the procedure of it all, if you want to move forward on March 3rd, which we really do need to know tonight, are we doing that or not? Then we would need to have you adopt a resolution placing the measure on the ballot by no later than your December 3rd meeting. That item that's on the ballot, the question is the ballot question, but what you're actually asking the voters to approve is the tax ordinance. And so what you have in your packet is a draft ordinance that would impose that transactions and use tax. And so on page, I don't know what, of the ordinance,
It's on,
I think it's the second one, first one, starting at the bottom of the first page of the ordinance, which is the second attachment, of the legislation, is where we start listing what the services could be. So it would be really terrific if we could get some guidance tonight about what those services are that you want to fund. If you cannot come to conclusion on that tonight, then you have to come to conclusion on that by December 3rd, and we would be essentially drafting that on the floor if we don't have some direction tonight. We could also come back to you on November 19th, but my suspicion is the council would prefer to have a full council for that conversation, and you may not have that on November 19th.
of course. To further clarify, as written, it says additional positions, additional officers, a code enforcement officer. Can additional, is that level of specificity where we need to get to tonight, or do we need to go further than that?
So for purposes, and I would look to the city attorney for guidance on this as well, if you use something as generic as the word additional, then it will be measured against what your current budgeted positions are now.
Okay.
So it would be on top of whatever they are now, and that would be one or more. So you will always have some discussion about what additional means if you don't specify.
Right.
Which is fine, but just know it's a little bit more confusing than having a single number there.
Okay. And if we, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I always, it's going to be more confusing for whom?
Future councils establishing budgets, figuring out what are we funding from this from this revenue source.
Okay.
And the understanding is, even if we put in all 5 things, we only fund them as up to the revenue generated.
Correct.
We're not overcommitted to funding.
If I can just repeat back what I think I understood the idea was from last spring, was it's about $2 million that our tax consultants have said would be raised with this level of tax. The positions would be funded from that revenue source, and then the remainder after the cost of those positions would be set aside in a council-approved reserve to be used to fund the increase in the subsidy to ECDC. So we're at about $1 million of general fund subsidy to support the operations of the Emeryville Child Development Center right now. That goes up every year. And so essentially capping the general fund subsidy at $1 million and then using this revenue source to support that increasing subsidy, so you would avoid that sort of question every year about whether you'd have to set aside additional general fund money. And then if there was money after that, it could be used at the council's discretion for capital projects.
Okay. Thank you. So, yes, Martinez.
I just had a clarifying question for EMC. So, Emily, if you wouldn't mind stepping up. So, could you describe the difference between the 2 graphs that show the reactions to additional information versus prioritization? So I'm trying to understand what's important to the Emeryville voters, and I see that on the reactions to additional information slide, it shows that people were very swayed by the pro arguments for the Child Development Center shows up at the top, the ideas concerning the Development Center. But on prioritization, what we see is public safety at the top.
Right.
So can you talk about how those are different?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, they're on different scales in terms of what we said. How compelling is this, or how important is this? This section where we asked about city priorities, it's very, technical and concrete, and it's potential clauses that could go in that 75-word statement. It's very specific to priorities. And the additional information, as we're calling it, as you've noted, these are sort of characterized as things that proponents might say. So they're intentionally tugging at heartstrings and saying, information that might be in some sort of outreach campaign or privately funded campaign down the road. So I would say to reconcile those two things, our takeaway is there's no way to know which item is the most compelling, because collectively we see that they're kind of all compelling. We can stack them against each other and see, relative to each argument, where they stand. But, looking at specifically the additional information in the arguments, it's really hard to gauge. Are they picking up on the fact that we said 90% of a child's brain develops before the age of 5, or that this measure is going to do the thing that's going to help that outcome? So it's kind of an impossible thing to know. The thing that we're taking away here is that, it's sort of convenient that it's in reverse of each other, because we know that both things are important to voters. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does answer my question. And is there something that that changed the most with additional information, where maybe they didn't have a specific feeling about something, but then they went positive or negative?
Yeah, so we didn't see a ton of movement after additional information. You can see on this slide, we went from 73% total support to 74% total support. The solid support increased a bit. But again, it's impossible to understand exactly what thing was that triggered those people who moved, what thing it was in their minds that they said that's the thing. So collectively, we look at, when we provide additional information, it helps move the needle. But to what extent, what thing it was,
what struck?
It's hard to know. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
If you go back to the horizontal graph of questions, what's important to you? I think is it fair to say that this 87% captures people who would be opposed to the measure anyways, but this is still their priority, versus the compellingness of the argument is simply saying, I don't find any argument compelling because I'm opposed to an increase in tax? I mean, is that a fair way for me to
Yeah, I think that's why we can see some difference in intensity on the item itself versus the message or the statement.
Whereas those who are more in the undecided or open to it, that's where we see the child care really have an impact, right? Because they're not reflected, that the anti ones are not willing to pay for more child care, but they are for policing and safety.
Right. Though the same could be said, people can still find that to be a compelling thing to say, even if they're not necessarily supporting the measure. Right. Though if we were to look at the crosstab of those who are opposing the measure, it is true that essentially the priorities and the messages in support are going to be rated lower than those who are supporting the measure.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So I think we need to first just say whether or not we want to do a general versus a special tax in March or November, and then go on to specific ordinance language. It seems like we have a consensus that everyone wants to do a special tax in March. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm sold on March.
Yeah.
I can go either way on special versus general, because I think the bar changes to a general.
Yeah, but we did all of our polling for a special, so I'm willing to stay on the track we're on so far. Okay, and so now we need to get down to specific ordinance language. Again, I'd love to hear from our ad hoc committee if you have suggestions for specific ordinance language. Yeah, Member Bowders.
I do. If we could go to, can you pull up the ordinance language?
No.
No?
Sherry can put it on the screen for me, though.
I'm looking at the bottom of page 1 and the top of page 2.
Section A.
Yes.
This one. So that one and 2. Go back. You can take mine. Yeah. We'll take one set.
Sure. So while she's doing that, well, the Budget and Governance Committee, when we set out and did this, and I know I brought in a rough proposal early on and worked on it with Councilmember Martinez, and then the Budget Advisory Committee looked at it as well.
Go down
There you go. So it's starting at the top there, and then, yeah. Some thoughts. I think that the place to work on sounds like it is in Section A here. So I've read the rest of the ordinance. I don't have any issues with the rest of the ordinance myself. Maybe others have questions, but I would propose the following in light of what I've heard. I think it's really important to not put numerical caps for a couple reasons. One, if you put a cap and set that in a language that says not more than a certain number, you're tying the hands in the future without knowing what the future may bring. And although it's not likely that we're going to need to do something other than what we've proposed here, it's not a good idea with a 2/3 type of initiative, which would then require 2/3 to change it, to put a particular cap. Likewise, if you were to say one police officer or one firefighter, the concern I have is that is a specific item, and therefore if the revenue stream decreases, a more ambiguous section like funding to support ECDC would become a secondary investment. Is that correct, generally, how that works, Mr. City Attorney? Specific number would get funded first, because if we say one firefighter, that is a specific thing, whereas funding to support will not, that's an ambiguous allocation.
Well, it also depends on the way that this is currently worded, is that the council isn't prioritizing one of these bullet points over the other.
I understand, but if one of these bullet points, regardless of its order, said one firefighter,
Mm-hmm.
would you be able to fund 2/3 of a firefighter under this ordinance?
Not with the revenue stream under.
Thank you. So you'd have to fund one. If you put one police officer, you'd have to fund one. And so what would happen is if the revenue stream went down, we'd be in a potential situation where we would have to do certain things and we would not have the money to adequately balance or support these other things. Whereas if it says additional positions, it can be used without having to fill a full position. It can be used if we were to need to balance it equitably across those things. So I think that not putting numbers in here first is the first thing. I support leading with the public safety positions because that is the thing that voters think about first. And when people read a long measure, and especially when you see that an ordinance, those are the things that make the first page. Those are the things people are going to want to see first anyway. So I personally support the fact that messaging is positive. Around 90% of a child's brain is developed by the age of 5. Those are all true things and those are persuasive. But I think that when you think about the campaign, and having done many campaigns for ballot measures, that is the thing that people care most about. Whether they are persuaded more or less by a particular argument to vote for it, that is the thing they care most about. So I would keep those in that position. But I would also make an adjustment, which is in light of what Vice Mayor Pat said, I would add in this list, probably after the police officer position, I would add something that says additional, and staff can wordsmith this, but additional support or additional positions within the police department to support officer work. Something that is broad enough so that we do not have to say it's a GIS mapping expert necessarily, something that maybe the public doesn't know what that means, or a social worker or a record specialist. We don't have to decide that off the start, but we should say something that captures what has been added or suggested as an additional set of priorities, because I think that better captures it. And I just want to add on to what the mayor said earlier, the Public Works Department is in desperate need of that code enforcement and assistant engineer position. And so I really, I just want to put out there that I do not want those to come off the list, because those are very important positions for the city right now. So those are my proposals.
May I ask a question of the city attorney?
Of course.
If we have positions in plural in the ordinance, does that lock us into multiple FTE?
No, I think as the city manager had indicated earlier, it doesn't lock you into, if I'm understanding your question correctly, it doesn't require you to fund multiple positions. You have the option of funding one position or more than one position.
Okay.
Can I just, on that real briefly, can we just put the S on both of those in parentheses?
That's what I was thinking.
Is there any reason why we couldn't say additional position with an S in parentheses so it's clear to the public it could be one or more?
And just to get on the nitty gritty with you guys here, does a code enforcement officer or an assistant engineer read as one of each grammatically?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. We wouldn't need multiple code enforcement officers right now.
Right. So, no, but that doesn't lock us into having to fully fund
No.
one, though, as written,
No.
Mr. City Attorney?
What it implies to me is that so the code enforcement officer and the assistant engineer implies a single position in each one of those.
Fully funded from this tax.
Exactly. Whereas because you have for the firefighter and police officer positions, right? Because those are plural, that implies one or more.
If we add in the line before the bullets to fund in whole or part the following local services, would that allow us the flexibility to not be locked into having to do that?
I like that.
Mr. City Attorney?
So
To fund, comma, in whole or part, comma, the following local services.
If I can interject, I think if you want parallel structure and you're trying to preserve the maximum flexibility, then it should be code enforcement officer position paren S, assistant engineer position paren S.
Yeah.
That's what I was
Okay,
getting
so we
at.
could do it that way too. That's
Okay.
So first of all, I want to thank the ad hoc committee and specifically Member Bowders for these because I had the same thoughts on all of this. I just say additional public safety support staff.
Personnel.
Yeah.
Or positions.
We can keep going down the position parentheses. And that, and the interesting to me is as I looked at this, when I deal with positions, I think of it in FTE. And so a code enforcement officer might be a 0.25 position, which I don't want, but it does not specify full-time. So I think we do have flexibility there. The last comment, and this is why I like the flexibility, although I think we have consensus for it, it's that first bullet. We don't have any control over the cost of that position, right? Correct. This is a contracted service, and so budgeting for it is always challenging. And so I really like having maximum flexibility there just because there is no give or take.
Right.
And so, and I really appreciate you saying that sales tax generation could be greater than 2 million and or significantly less. And if we're locked in, that's really challenging.
Yep.
So.
Member Martinez, any specific notes?
Nope. I think I got all my questions answered, and I agree with the changes that
A clarifying question?
Suggested.
Yep.
Just on the last comment.
Yeah.
So I heard two different versions. One was additional public safety support positions, and the other was additional positions in the police department. Those can be two very different things.
I think public safety.
I think we've all
captures what
agreed
we're going
Public
to.
safety is fine with me.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you for asking.
Particularly gives you the chance to bridge both.
Right. I have a clarifying question. In the section number 2, if you scroll that first page down just a little bit so we can see number 2, the operative section. So it says commencing the first day of this calendar quarter, commencing more than 110 days after the adoption of this ordinance. Sherry or Michael, is the adoption considered the day it's certified, or is it considered the day the voters had voted on it, regardless of when it gets certified? What's the operative date? Because there's 91 days between April, May, and June, and then there are 27 days after the election. So there would be an adequate number of days to have it start on our fiscal year, July 1, if it's the day that people vote. But if it's the day it's certified, it's likely to not begin until September. So I'm curious, for budgeting purposes, when it would begin.
When you talked to the state, Sherry, did you get...
I got the impression that it was the day after the vote. Yeah, so like if the election's on March 3rd, that if it passed, that it would, the 10-day count starts then.
The next day.
But then you have to go to the beginning of the next calendar month, which would be July 1.
The next quarter. Yeah. So, okay, so we do start counting on the 4th, as opposed to if they certify on the 25th, we would be after July 1st. So
That's the way I understood it. Of course, we'll confirm that before we
Okay.
come back for final.
Because I would just wanted to add that I think that if we do pass it in March and we have until July, I think we can have a budget session to determine these public safety personnel. Like, we can have that conversation between now and then and put these things in there.
I love it.
Member Donahue.
I just have some questions. If, the professionals here have a response to having this kind of more open-ended language, and whether it makes it more difficult for the public to pass in your experience.
Tashawn might have stuff to add too. So what we polled and what voters see is that 75-word statement. So kind of what you end up putting in the actual measure itself, voters don't necessarily see. Some might, those who pay attention or do all of their research. But the most important thing is how you craft that 75-word statement. And in that 75-word statement, as we have tested, you will include some specifics. Because it's a special tax, we have to indicate how much it's going to generate, what the tax is, what it's going to pay for. And so to that extent, we are providing some information to voters when they go to actually vote. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Okay,
sort of.
that's
If I may, Scott, nobody reads those things. Like, yeah.
There's that.
Like 10 people will read the ordinance and they will already have firm opinions about things, those people who do that.
It's true. 3 or 4 of them are sitting up here.
Yeah, half of them are here.
And there's the other two.
And in terms of our messaging, we would be a little more general in terms. So if you are saying adding 2 police officers, we would say an additional police officers, because you don't want to get to the point to where after it's passed and you may not necessarily be able to fund 2 police officers, and you have someone coming to council saying, but in this fact sheet you said 2 police officers.
Yeah.
So we want to be specifically general in terms of in the words that we're using, so it gives you that flexibility on what you can and cannot do with the money.
We strive to be specifically general and aggressively neutral. Is that it for clarifying questions?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on the language?
Well, I was attracted to the most flexible, just from knowing what it's like. Every year we have to balance and juggle and really look at it, so.
Yeah. So I think we're all kind of moving towards maximum flexibility with the careful grammatical phrasing our city attorney is helping guide us through.
So, Madam Mayor, with regard to the list, you haven't addressed the last bullet?
Yes.
Can you bring it back up?
It's there.
I can see it.
Oh.
It's on this screen. 2 screens.
Funding to support the Emeryville Child Development Center and/or capital improvement projects.
So
Changes, leave it the same.
I heard what SEIU said about that being there, but I really would go back to the prior comment that if we have, we don't know the future of 2 things. One is the sales tax, and so if the sales tax goes really well, we could do things like put additional money aside in a fund for ECDC to preserve it in longevity. We may come up with a capital project. I'm thinking of ECDC itself. We didn't have enough money when we put the bids out for the roof to do the entire thing we wanted to do. So this could be money that could be flexibly used to do both of those things without undermining I think the priority among all of us has been clear that it's for the Child Development Center. But the other thing that I want to just put out there is that likely the thing that I'm most nervous about is that the county is running a measure at the same time. And so, but the expenditure plan that the county has proposed does not give a lot of money to Emeryville. And it does, because we're already doing the right thing by paying people a living wage and having on-staff employees who get health care and pensions and benefits. And so the problem I have with the county proposal is the county is going to take a lot of sales tax from Emeryville, but not reinvest it in Emeryville. So the need to have the Child Development Center is needs to stay there, but I also just think that the capital improvement projects, because under there, well, there'll be a certain amount of capital for certain investments. When we had that proposal last time, I had multiple meetings with Wilma Chan's office and people at the county supervisors, the county council office, and their expenditure plan. They came back after telling us in this meeting here that this would help our city. They came back and basically said, you actually won't be eligible for those capital improvement funds for a lot of different reasons. So I just want to highlight that I think we should keep that in there. And there's nothing that obligates us to do it for one or the other, but we should see how that unfolds. So I think we should keep it there.
I agree. I think we've drafted this to have a lot of flexibility, and it's consistent with our council priorities and policies thus far. Have we gone through the grammatical list of keeping it consistent with positions, parentheses? Do you need any other adjustments from us?
No, we'll work on the language and bring it back to you, but I think we got what we needed in terms of services.
I would like to highlight one other thing. In the ballot question itself, it starts with 911 services, which is the lowest responsiveness in the polling.
Yeah.
I would
To revise the ballot tab to take that out, and it's 6 words, I think. Oh, go ahead, Emily.
That's
Hit
what I
it.
was gonna say.
Yeah, I tend to lead with just say public safety.
Yeah, you have an opportunity still. I mean, what we tested was something that was kind of our best attempt at what could be. And obviously the city attorney reviewed it, but now that we know what's most important, we can refine that a little bit to acknowledge what people care about. Yeah.
And it's a positive thing. I think it's because everyone knows that if you call 911 in Emeryville, you're just going to turn around and they're right there. It's kind of freaky, to be honest. They just, yeah, it's not a problem.
Can I suggest then, if we're going to remove that language, which I'm fine with, can we then look to see if we can provide something a little more holistic as opposed to nurturing care of children and families that actually says child care for working families or nurturing environments and child care for working? Just add something that makes it clear, because I think it's a little ambiguous, nurturing care of children and families. And I think we got to the end of our 75 words and we just figured out how to squeeze it in by putting this children/families thing. And I understand that, but if we're going to take those 6 words back from the other side, which I think is a good idea, I would like to see something more representative of what we saw people find as another convincing argument, which is pre-K, early child education. We should spell that out more clearly than nurturing.
Yeah. There was an item that I don't think was in there that we wanted to include.
We need you to speak into the microphone if it's going to be on the record.
We're missing a piece, I think, so we need to revise the question.
I think it was the...
Agree?
I agree wholeheartedly, and I also have a lot of faith that staff has this to bring us back to us.
Okay.
I think those two things are equally true.
Okay. Have we given you full and complete direction to move forward on this?
On that question, yes.
Okay.
So
Next question.
just to confirm, then March 3rd, 2020.
Yep.
With the special tax and the services as you identified, additional firefighter positions, additional police officers positions, additional public safety support positions, code enforcement officer positions, assistant engineer positions, and then the same bullet with regard to ECDC and capital improvement.
Yep.
Next question.
Oh, is the county going out for the March election? That's what that was it.
Yes.
Sorry.
County will be doing a child care tax in March.
And you all will be meeting with the school board on November 7th to discuss the possibility that they are considering a parcel tax in March as well. So with that in mind, we would like to put out some communication to the public in November with regard to what's being considered. It will be messaging that would go out before you would take the final vote, obviously on placing this on the ballot. So that's obviously why we have our consultants to help us with that messaging. So if you had, first of all, any objection to us doing that messaging in November, we need to know now.
No objections.
No.
Being none, we're moving on. And then if you had any suggestions in terms of your familiarity, obviously, with the community is much better than mine, things that you would like us to emphasize or illustrate in that messaging. Beyond, I mean, we will be obviously using the direction that we got tonight about the services and the support in the community for those services from the poll.
I think
it's sufficient. I think if you follow the things that people identified as their priorities, that is consistently, and the mayor does ballot measures as much as I do, I think, but that is consistently tax with the messaging people want when they're initially being confronted with a measure. They want to know that it matches their priorities. So I think we should have that be the lead.
Any other feedback?
I have one item, but unless you have other questions, you
One
may
more.
have it. Yeah.
So in the ordinance, we are proposing that the oversight body for the tax be the Budget Advisory Committee. It's already a community committee. It's stood up with very skilled people who we believe would provide appropriate oversight for this measure. So that is what's currently written into the tax measure.
I support that.
I support that.
Yeah. That's all my questions.
My question, Madam Mayor, is it doesn't need to be decided tonight, but due to the fact that we would be voting on this resolution on December 3rd, and the deadline to submit everything, Madam Clerk, is the 6th, correct?
Correct.
And I believe the deadline to submit arguments for is the 10th.
Correct.
We can and should probably establish an ad hoc committee to determine if, among us, we would like to write the argument in favor, because we should have that going concurrent to this, so that it's prepared to go, so the clerk has it when we're ready to complete the package on the 3rd. And so, if we can take a vote or make a nomination for that this evening, I would just wanted to put that up for discussion so we can move forward with that.
Are you comfortable with that, Mr. City Attorney? It's not listed as one of our...
Actually, yeah.
We were going to tee that up for you to do along with the legislation, and I didn't think to include it tonight.
On the 3rd, it would be really late to start figuring out who can talk about that.
We could bring that on the 19th.
I was going to say.
Okay.
Can it be on the 5th as too late? We published the 5th, didn't we?
Yeah,
we did.
Yeah.
We could do a special meeting at 7:14 on the 5th.
I have to republish anyway.
Yeah, we can do that.
On the
Should we
5th?
publish
Special
it?
meeting.
So let's just, I think we need a month to, because we need to have 5 signers in favor of an argument, ideally, and if we have an ad hoc committee, then I think what we would like to do is we either need to decide at the council meeting if we need to decide at the next meeting, do we want to empower the ad hoc committee to select those 5 people, or does the guidance from the council want to be that the council will, all 5 of us, as we do with Measure C, be the signatories to the argument, and we're going to entrust 2 people to write it. So I know I did the writing on Measures C and S, and I just wanted to, having done the process twice, I just wanted to make sure that we didn't get behind on that process.
So we'll if the mayor's okay with this, we'll schedule a special meeting on the 5th, just right before the regular meeting commences.
I think that gives us
Yeah.
a more adequate amount of time. Thank you. All right. Anything else?
I don't think so.
Okay. We got through that.
That's it.
All right.
There's something else. But
Well, that was it. So then the meeting is adjourned.